On this episode, we'll take a look at what you can achieve with an extension tube, why you should know that there are different kinds of extension tubes, and how the professionals do their macro photography. Also, I'll use this episode to bring you something that I just talked about on another podcast about film photography. This is Tips on the Top Floor, episode 774 for Thursday, April the 27th, 2017.
Tips from the top floor, tips from the top, alright, from the top floor.
Hey and all, welcome. This is Tips on the Top Floor, the longest running photography show on the planet. My name is Chris Marquardt and welcome to the show. You know what? I've completely forgot to tell you about something last week because I completely forgot that actually happened, and I had to be reminded by Matt, Release Pixie Matt, the person who has been helping the show behind the scenes like forever, almost from the beginning. By the way, thanks, Matt. And he pointed me to the kind of insignificant date of April the 18th, which is an anniversary for this show, because that's when Tips on the Top Floor was on the air, well, on the air quotes, on the internets for the first time 12 years ago. So happy birthday, Tips from the Top Floor, for 12 years. I feel old. I really do. Anyway, 12 years. Wow. So yeah, I'm not thinking about stopping just yet. I need your help though, right? The iTunes reviews things I talked about last year. Go leave a review or a star rating on iTunes to help the show be a bit more visible. Anyway, let's get right into it. My better half, Monica, and I, we've been doing this film photography thing forever. I mean, we both grew up in the analog times, and we used to shoot film long ago. We used to develop our own film and even do prints, and then we both kind of got taken over by the digital side for quite a while. And as you might know, back in maybe 2009, both of us kind of rediscovered film photography, which was quite an amazing journey, because at that point I had thought this would have been over. I wouldn't be doing that anymore in my life. But we have both realized that there is a lot of stuff still to film photography, and that's why we're doing it, and that's why we then finally wrote the book about it, and the Film Photography Handbook. And we're seeing more interest in this. We're seeing more questions, especially from digital natives who kind of wonder what this is all about. We're holding workshops in this area, and we've just a short while ago been asked if there is a German podcast about film photography, and we looked around and there wasn't. So we're making our own. And it's a new podcast. It's in German. It's called Absolut Analog, the same as our book is called in Germany. And I think we have 4 episodes released now. We're recording more. We quickly realized we won't run out of material there anytime soon. And I thought it might be a nice experiment, because I know that a lot of you are also into that, or at least curious about it. So I thought I'd do a little experiment and every now and then bring some of the topics that we talked about on Absolut Analog on the German podcast and talk about them here. So here's the first one. And it's something that just happened a few days ago. A friend said that he was getting interested in film photography again. And more in making analog prints, though, than in developing film. And I asked him why. And he kind of answered that the film is like the boring side, there's nothing interesting in developing film. It's always the same. It's the creative side lies in making the print. And while that might be true, that is only partially true for film. And that's what I want to talk about. Color film. Well, yeah, color film is pretty boring, because if you look at color negative film and color slide film, positive film, the processes for those are 100% standardized. Very repeatable results. It's pretty much an industrialized process. If you hand in any roll of color negative film. It can be by Kodak or by Fuji or by Agfa or by whoever. The lab will be able to process that because it is standardized. This is called the C41 color negative process. So there is not much variation. Well, there is a little bit, but no lab will do this for you. So you will typically hand it in and get a standardized result back. And that is why you could and sometimes still can get a 1 hour photo development. 1 hour photo, because it is possible to do that because it is so standardized. For black and white, that is not at all true. In theory, you can develop any black and white film in any black and white chemistry. Kodak film, you can put this in Ilford chemistry and you'll get a result. Ilford film in Kodak chemistry, Agfa film in, I don't even know. I mean, there are too many manufacturers of developer and fixer to name them all here. So there is a lot of mix and match. But what's the deal? Why mix and match? Why not go, if you buy Kodak film, go with Kodak developer? Because what you do has an influence on the outcome. And there are several parameters, especially in black and white film, that you can kind of change, and that will yield different results. One is obviously the film and developer combination. That's kind of the first and most important decision to make. Second is, what temperature do you develop at? It really has a pretty significant influence if you develop at room temperature water or developer and fixer, or if you do the same with slightly warmer or slightly colder chemistry. The dilution of the developer is another factor in the way the development result comes out. Dilution because you're typically mixing the developer from a concentrate. And then even the agitation, which means how much you move that development tank during development. Even that is going to play a role in what the resulting picture will look like. And changing these parameters will, among other things, influence things like grain structure in the photo or the resulting negatives and their contrast distribution. An example. It's hard to talk about this. I understand it's hard to talk about this, but if you have ever developed film, I bet a lot of you who did that and shot black and white would have probably gone to something like Kodak Tri-X, which is a favorite film of many people. And developing that in Rodinal, classic recipe, 1 to 50 dilution, 20 degrees Celsius for the water, that yields a very kind of recognizable result. The way the grain structure looks is very, I can look at that and go, oh yeah, I think that's probably the combination that has been used there. If you develop the same Tri-X film in Kodak HC110, another very famous Kodak developer, then you have a very different result. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we're not even looking at push or pull development, but just as an initial idea, the choice of film and developer in black and white and the choice of the parameters, there's many recipes out there, will have an influence on the resulting negative. And then that should be a starting point for any prints that you do. But if you just hand in that film to any lab, here's a black and white film, develop it. Well, as there is no standard, they will develop it they will develop it just fine, but they will put it in some standard soup, And a different lab might use a different type of developer. There are no standards. There's no repeatability. So you will have, your results will be all over the place. And even with the same lab, color film, you put in a machine and it does it for you. Black and white film is developed by hand usually because there's just not the volume anymore. So there's a very good chance that even if the same person does it 2 times in a row, it will probably be slightly different. So my answer to my friend was, making prints is cool, but if that's where you want to go, developing your own film is kind of a necessity in my book. Depending on how you shoot that roll of film, you might even need a different kind of treatment, and probably one that the big lab won't just be able to provide. So, yeah, that was my short analog film corner. Do I need a jingle for that? I don't know. let me know if you find this interesting. We have plenty of topics on our list to talk about on that German podcast, and I will happily bring some of those here onto Tips from the Top Floor. Oh, by the way, if you're interested in how different film development recipes and film combinations can look, there's a good website that lets you check some of those or many of those out in a visual way, and that's filmdev.org, filmdev.org. A great place to explore different types of film and different types of developer recipes. Check it out, filmdev.org. So here we are. It's the place in the show where the music picks up, and this would normally be the place in the podcast, usually somewhere in the middle of the show, where I put in a sponsor read and tell you about a product that's hopefully interesting to you. And those sponsors are an important part in making sure that I can bring this show to you every week, and that it is free and that it stays free. And this week, I don't have a sponsor. So I'm pretty much paying everything for this week's episode out of my own pocket. That includes the time that goes into making this show, the hosting, which I just recently upgraded to a new hoster with faster SSD drives that's more expensive, and the paid online service for audio processing that I use, and so on. Now, I'm not asking you for money. Don't switch off. I'm not asking for your money. I'm asking you to help the show become more visible. Because as much as you might like Tips from the Top Floor, if it's not seen by new people, if it's not visible, then that will sooner or later become a problem. And that's why I need a minute of your time to give Tips from the Top Floor a rating on iTunes, or even better, a short written review. And it can be as short as a few words, because this is really a virtuous cycle. If I reach more people with the show, I get more feedback, and that will translate into more ratings, and that will then rate the show higher with interesting advertisers, and I will be able to make more shows, and so on and so on. And iTunes is still the world's #1 place by far where people discover new podcasts. And there are always new listeners out there, and there's so much in the photography field in terms of podcasts that it is really harder and harder to stick out. So new people do not discover Tips on the Top Floor as much as they used to, and this is why I need your help. Even if you use another podcast client, by the way, on your smartphone, the chances are that their search receives its data from the iTunes directory. So people are still searching on iTunes, even though they don't know it. So in short, if you want to help make sure that Tips on the Top Floor stays around, go to iTunes, leave a review. And it's fairly easy to do, by the way. On your Mac or on your PC, just go to tfttf.com/iTunes, tfttf.com/iTunes, and then from that page, you can open it in iTunes and give a rating or a review there. It's a bit stranger on an iPhone. It's easiest to open the podcast app and search for photography, and then tap on Tips on the Top Floor in the search results, and then you can do the rating there. Even if you're subscribed, that's the easiest way to get to the rating screen on an iPhone. And if you've already done that, if you've already given a star rating or a review, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. You're an awesome bunch of people, and I love making this show for you.
Chris, this is TJ from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I have a technical question that I've really been wondering. I shoot a lot of macro in the past, but just with a point-and-shoot camera. I recently upgraded to a Nikon D300S, and I'm shooting with an AFS 18 to 55 millimeter f3.5 lens. I really want to shoot macro, and I bought some macro extension tubes. Now, I know that may be an issue with my CPU lens, but the D300S does allow you to shoot with non-CPU lenses, but I haven't had any success in making that system work, and I'm wondering if you have any insight. Thanks.
Hey TJ, great question. Let's take this apart piece by piece. First of all, what does macro mean? That's the first thing we need to define here, because macro, today, this term is being used quite loosely. And typically nowadays you would call it, or manufacturers will call it, pretty much a close-up capability of a lens. So if a lens says, I'm a macro lens, it usually means you can get close up to things and show them really big. But technically speaking, macro actually means a magnification of 1:1 or bigger, which, means that the what's in front of the camera is the same size on the sensor or bigger. So you will see that it's denoted by like 1:1, which means it's the same size on the sensor as it is in front of the camera. 1:2 would mean that 1 centimeter in front of the camera would be 2 centimeters on the sensor. But again, you will see the term macro being used so loosely these days. So it means big. It means getting close and showing something big on the photo. Okay, you say you're shooting with the Nikon D300S and an AFS 18-55 f3.5, which I do not know. There is some Nikon in the house, but not owned by me. But I looked it up. So there's the AFS 18-55 lens. It's a CPU lens. Let's define that for a second for all those non-Nikon people listening. CPU lens. A CPU is pretty much a computer in the lens, a chip in the lens. And I think Nikon, somewhere in the mid 80s, Nikon began to put chips in the lenses, so the lens could report back the aperture, and then later even the focus distance that you set, and that enables functionality that you wouldn't have without the chip in the lens. So it also means the lens has contacts, and as a way to speak to the camera. And what that typically also means is that a non-CPU lens is often a manual focus lens, manual aperture, ring, and so on. I'm simplifying this, but you get the general gist here. Okay, so you want to shoot with an extension tube setup to enable macro. Extension tubes have, let's define these for a second. An extension tube increases the distance between the camera and the lens. That's as simple as it gets. That's the most simple extension tube. It's just taking the lens off the camera and moving it a bit away from the camera and then giving that some light sealing around it, which is, a tube with a bayonet on both sides, one for the camera, one for the lens. And that, in turn, will make the lens focus closer. So if the minimum focus distance of your lens is, 3 feet, now all of a sudden, with the lens slightly removed from the camera, you might be able to focus down to 1 foot. And now there are two kinds of extension tubes. Ones are electrical ones that have contacts on both sides. So the camera can talk to the lens through the extension tube, and then it can tell the lens to set a certain aperture, and it can tell the lens to autofocus, or if you have a manual focus lens, it would be able to report back to the camera, and the camera would know, and that would enable some functionality. And then there are the passive ones, the passive extension tubes, which are just tubes, no contacts. And that means you're down to manually setting both aperture and focus. And if you're using passive extension tubes, the camera won't be able to talk with the lens and get that information. That might make things a bit more difficult. The camera won't be able to autofocus the lens, and so on. Now, if you use a passive extension tube or several, sometimes they come in sets of 3 with 3 different widths, so you can kind of stack them or use different ones. If you use passive extension tubes, the ones without contacts, then you have to manual focus, and you should have a lens with an aperture ring, so it would allow you to set the aperture on the lens. If that lens does not have an aperture ring, the lens will probably be wide open and stay there. And there might be tricks around that, but in general, that's what's happening, because the default status of a lens, the default state of a lens is wide open, because that's what you want when looking through the viewfinder. So you get the most light and the most, the biggest picture possible, the brightest picture possible. So the lens will be wide open, and that is not ideal for macro photography, where you would typically shoot at smaller apertures to get enough depth of field. The focus should work all the time, like the manual focus with most lenses. Well, I'm not sure about Nikon. With Canon, you can just switch pretty much any lens to manual focus mode and just manual focus it. I think I remember that some Nikon cameras have that switch on the camera, so you'll have to find that out if you can manually focus the lens. But if you use an active extension tube, one with contacts that lets the lens talk to the camera. The camera should autofocus and let you control the aperture. But you know what? Most serious macro photographers prefer manual focus anyway. And if you're really close to something, you have very little depth of field. Just the slightest motion of you will throw the picture out of focus. Working with a tripod and what's called a macros focusing rail is a great option. That's where you pre-focus the camera kind of in the vicinity, and then you put it on the tripod, and in between the camera and the tripod there's this rail system that lets you slide forward and backward with a little knob, and you would fine-tune the focus by sliding that camera, the entire camera including its lens, forward and backward slightly while looking through the viewfinder or on the live view. But that kind of really depends on what kind of macro you want to shoot. Again, macro is a very loose term these days, so maybe it's just a close-up and maybe you'll be fine handheld. But that's the general idea of how you can go about making that lens work. And maybe, just maybe, another lens might be a good option. I would think about a bit of an older 50mm 1.8 or something with a macro extension tube. Those make for pretty good close-up lenses, so maybe that's an option. Hey, that was it for this episode of Tips from the Top Floor. Thank you so much for listening or for being subscribed. Hit the big subscribe button, or is it the follow button? Anyway, the big button on the website tfttf.com to subscribe and get the show for free in your sleep.
No, I remember that
If you want your questions answered on the show, or if you want to comment on anything I said here, maybe correct me on what I said about the Nikon non-CPU lenses, record it on your voice memo app on your smartphone and send it to voice@tfttf.com. That's voice@tfttf.com. Don't delay it. Do it right now. I would love to hear from you. voice@tfttf.com. And thanks again for your iTunes ratings and reviews. They're really a wonderful way to support the show. Thanks to the exposure through ratings and reviews on iTunes, Tips from the Top Floor can be found by new listeners and the community can grow. And that's awesome. And I thank you all for your support. Music for the show by Jeff Smith, silent partner in Hans Peter Kagerud, publishing by Release Pixie, Matt Rafsitar Armstead, Slack invitations handled by our CIO Russ. My name is Chris Marquardt. Follow me on Facebook and on Twitter at Chris Marquardt, Chris Marquardt. And of course, go out, take amazing photos, be nice to each other, and happy shooting.